there was an overwhelming kind of sense of, okay, we need to go after the people who did this. We need to go after those who attacked us. And so that was where the decision, not long after that, was to go to Afghanistan. Because when Afghanistan is where the al-Qaeda training camps were, that was where bin Laden was hiding, where the planning for the attacks took place. The decision to go into Afghanistan was based on the desire to, okay, let's get rid of bin Laden. Let's get rid of al-Qaeda. Let's drive them back. Let's make sure that they're never able to attack from that base in Afghanistan again, that they won't pose a threat. And so it was very quickly after 9/11, by early next year, that was basically they were driven out, not only out al-Qaeda, but also the Taliban, completely driven out of Afghanistan. And at that point, you get to, okay, now what are we doing? What's next? What's our goal? What's our mission? What are we trying to accomplish here now? And it's at that point where the broad consensus, the let's go and get them, the mentality of seeking justice for these attacks begins to crack and begins to break down a little bit. Because when you have a clear focus on one person or one group based on one attack, that's one thing. But then after that, it starts to go, okay, now what are we doing? What's our goal? What's our mission? What are we trying to accomplish here now? The focus shifts almost immediately from not just going after one specific terrorist organization, but it becomes a broad war on terrorism in general. We're going to go after pretty much every terrorist group around the world that might pose a threat. And that really broadens the scope of what the focus is. The idea was we're going to stamp out terrorism wherever it is. We're going to hit all these groups. But to be able to do that is a massive mission and an expansion. And that is where things kind of get a little bit messy and get a little bit fuzzy. That's where kind of we start to get into a little bit of arguments amongst ourselves on what we should actually be doing. And the mission targeted of what is our intent, what's our goals here, starts to get really muddled. But it wasn't until you get to Iraq and the decisions leading up to Iraq and the decision to shift focus from bin Laden and Afghanistan over to Iraq where everything starts to take a different turn. You really start to have this division where the broad sense of we're all in this together. We all need to band together. Support for the U.S., both internally and internationally, begins to start to wane a little bit. And so the war on terror came to signify the next 20 years was a direct reaction to the fear of the tragedy of 9/11. When we're afraid of things, we tend to overreact. That was one of the goals of bin Laden and what he wanted to try to do. He wanted to hit us hard to the point where we would come in to the Middle East. And in his mind, his thought was, okay, I'm going to draw America into this conflict here. And they're going to fight on this turf. One of two things will happen. One, I'm going to draw them in and they're going to be in a prolonged conflict where they're going to be bogged down here for a long period of time, or I'm going to beat them. He thought his forces could beat the U.S. military. He was wrong on that count. But on the other count, that's where we get into where we find ourselves today. The war in Afghanistan just came to an end. 20 years later, it was still ongoing. The amount of time, money, effort, the number of people that have lost their lives since has been enormous. You notice that as soon as the decision was made to pull out of Afghanistan, finally, after 20 years, it was immediate second guessing of, well, was this the right decision? Should we have left? Should we have stayed? So there was that back and forth. You see that it's been all over the media ever since, just kind of hammering away at the decision to leave Afghanistan, the chaos of the people in Kabul trying to scramble to get onto airplanes so they could leave, trying to get out of that situation, knowing the Taliban was coming in back to take over. And then there's the question of respect to our combat veterans, military service members who did put their lives in line, and those who did sacrifice, coming back saying, what was it all for? What was I there for? What was the point of all all of this? Why was I there for this long? Why did I risk my life for something that ended up collapsing so quickly? It seemed like it was for nothing. That's a tough situation to be in. That's a tough pill to swallow. I've heard many service members talk about how they didn't really understand very well what veterans from Vietnam were talking about. And now they really do. It's hard to say like, okay, yeah, it really was worth it. Or it's kind of hard to say that you shouldn't feel that way. Many of them were kind of like, what was the mission for? What was our purpose? What are we actually doing here now? Especially after 2011, once bin Laden was killed, what's our mission and purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? And not getting very clear answers, not getting a very clear direction. And what would be respectful to them? Is it disrespectful to them to just abandon the mission and to give up? Or is it more respectful to them to not risk creating more combat veterans and more casualties and risk more lives? So, I mean, you can understand why so many are angry at the decision to leave. And you can also understand why so many are just thankful that it's ended. The argument for staying is keeping things stable. But at the same time, we've been there for 20 years and nothing has seemingly improved. We can look back to Iraq for lessons of this. All this was happening in Afghanistan. I just kept rethinking of how everything came about in Iraq as well. The same kind of situation happened because Iraq and Afghanistan, they kind of fell similarly. The governments and the militaries that we built up fell rather quickly. When we went into Iraq, broke up the Iraqi government, deposed Saddam Hussein, it took something that was kind of stable and completely upended it. It took a lot of things that were simmering underneath the surface there, oiled them up and amplified them and created a bigger terrorism threat in that area than there was before. At the point where we ended up leaving, it wasn't too long after that when you completely destabilize an area, there was a power vacuum. Al-Qaeda terrorist groups came in and filled that void that eventually created ISIL. You could look at that situation in one of two ways. Should we have left in the first place? Should we have stayed there and tried to maintain a stable situation because it was unstable as soon as we left? The other argument is, if the situation was so unstable, what would it have been any different if we had left at any other time? Would have staying there made a difference? If it was so unstable after spending so much time and effort and money into trying to build up a stable government and a stable military in Iraq and Afghanistan, what difference would it have made to stay longer if we would have ended up with the same outcome regardless? Should we have poured more money into it and cost more American lives because of it? Or was it just time to pull the plug? So depending on your orientation, you could look at it and come to different conclusions. We should never have left, or we shouldn't have been there in the first place. And being there longer is not going to make a difference except for drain more money and cost more lives. We have to kind of take stock of 20 years later, what the world looks like now as opposed to what it looks like then. Is there still a threat in Afghanistan? The Taliban, who was in control since 1996 of Afghanistan, had kind of given a safe haven to Al-Qaeda. There was kind of a mutual agreement. They shared similar ideologies, but they weren't one and the same. So it's important to distinguish between the two. That while they were certainly sympathetic to bin Laden and his group, the Taliban is more of a local militant force. They're interested in control of Afghanistan, and they're not really that interested in global ambitions. Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, completely different. And so it's important to distinguish between groups that are locally focused and groups that are focused on more of a broad global control, or they want to wage global jihad, as it's termed. The goal of Al-Qaeda was effectively to implement a strict view interpretation of Islam around the entire world and subject all Muslims to that. This is something you saw very clearly when ISIL was established in 2014. Al-Baghdadi came out and said, I am not a leader. We have a world caliphate. All Muslims around the world will bow to and pay tribute to me and my group. Very different from a local militant force like the Taliban. As I'm watching what happened in Afghanistan, it wasn't an exact replay of what happened in Iraq, but there were a lot of similarities. If I was going to pick which one I'd rather have, do I want a situation in Iraq that's eventually leads to a group like ISIL, or do I want a Taliban in Afghanistan? I'd much rather go with the Taliban than ISIL. And if you're pretty much in a situation where you're going to pick between one of those two options, one is much more of a direct threat and one is much more brutal than the other. Our interventions in other countries, have they made us safer or have they made it worse? That's an open question. That's one that's up for debate. But it's hard to make the case that the overall terrorism threat in the world is lower now than it was 20 years ago. Would we be better off if we had never done either of these wars? Would we be better off if we hadn't gone there to begin with? Would we be better off if we didn't take the approach of invasions? Some estimates are that we spent somewhere upwards of $6 trillion, $150 to $350 million per day, every day for 20 years. What else could we have done with that money? What other programs could have been spent on? And are we better off now than we were then? Would there be the same level of terrorism threat, or would it have kind of died down with 9/11? Would 9/11 have been the peak instead of being the starting point? We'll never know, but it's something to think about in terms of our reactions and what we can take away from trying to decide what we do next and what we do in the future. Because if we keep repeating the same mistakes, then we're going to continue to have similar outcomes.